afternoon, everyone. You should have all just come flooding in from your waiting room, virtual waiting room. So thank you for joining us. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome you to the third afternoon of the Climate Risk Summit, which is being run by the COP26 Universities Network, which is a group of UK universities who are working hard to make sure that we're offering the support and impetus for the UK to host, hopefully, a successful COP. Which will be happening in about a month's time from now. So the past 3 days have been focused, including today, on climate risk. The previous 2 afternoon sessions, if you had not been able to join them, were focusing on particular areas of climate risk. And today we've appointed some climate risk fellows who are going to be talking particular about climate risk communication, building upon some of the things that have been discussed earlier in the week. So what we're going to do is we're going to invite Professor Liz Bentley, who's the Chief Executive of the Royal Meteorological Society, to give us some introductory words, sharing with us her experiences of the highs and lows of communicating about climate change. And then after that, we're going to launch into some interactive sessions to do with climate communication. So I hope you all find this helpful. Please note that the event is being recorded. So if you are asked to make a contribution, a question or otherwise, please only do so if you're happy for yourself to be recorded. Thank you so much. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Liz.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation just to say a few words at this Climate Risk Summit. I'm delighted to be here and wanted to share with you some of the Royal Meteorological Society's experiences around communicating the risks of climate change and the work that we've been doing in this area. I've got 3 things I really want to highlight, I guess, as part of this message. The first thing is to say when we're communicating climate risks, one size doesn't fit all. We need to recognise that people come from different backgrounds, they have different levels of expertise, they use different terminology, and quite often in different sectors we use different terminology to communicate risks. And climate risks themselves are complex and often interconnected, and so sometimes oversimplifying the communication around climate risks can actually be more misleading. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second is about who is best placed to communicate climate risks. Is it the experts or is it good communicators? Well, I guess the ideal model is a good expert who is a good communicator. And so some of the things that we've been doing at the Royal Meteorological Society is working with those experts, working with those good communicators and bringing them together so that we can upskill good communicators to become expert communicators and vice versa. And my final point I wanted to highlight was how best to communicate risk around climate change. Communicating it needs to be clear, it needs to be meaningful, but most of all, I think it needs to be relevant to the person that you're communicating those risks to. It needs to resonate with them. It needs to have something that they take an action, it changes behaviour around. And there's also a role for using visuals, and that's something we've been trying to do at the Royal Meteorological Society. It's not just words that we use, it's the visuals that we use to communicate risk can be more important than the words themselves. So just thinking about the work that we've been doing at the Royal Met Society, there's a few things I really wanted to mention. One in particular was the climate change communication training that we've been delivering to a number of broadcasters in the UK, so the BBC, ITV and Sky News. And this started about 2 or 3 years ago when we started to upskill the broadcast meteorologists that worked across those 3 platforms, who had for many years, actually probably decades, been told not to engage on the topic of climate change. So they stuck to weather. They were invited to talk about weather events. So if there was a hurricane taking place, they'd be asked to talk about that hurricane and why hurricanes form, but were shying away from a conversation around what climate change impacts had around particular weather events. And the editorial policy has shifted dramatically in the UK, and these experts in meteorology needed to bring themselves up to date with the climate science, the climate thinking, and to be given the confidence, I think, to start answering these questions. So that's something the Royal Met Society has been doing over recent years. And it started, as I say, with the broadcast meteorologists, but it's now moved on to the journalists and the producers at these organisations who are really interested in understanding climate science, understanding how best to communicate around this subject. So that just gives you a flavour. And what's wonderful for me is over the last few years, we've seen a number of these broadcasters now using the tools, the information, the visuals that we've shared with them over the course of the years. So if you ever watch Good Morning Britain or follow Laura Tobin, she's actively communicating climate change now and using a lot of the visuals that we shared with her. The BBC are doing a regular climate check now as well, and also across multiple platforms of the BBC, whether it's online, radio or on television, there's much more engagement, much more communication around climate change. And Sky News have recently introduced their daily climate show as well. So again, there's been a lot of progress in upskilling these people to talk about the risks around climate change and communicating it to the wide audiences that they can reach, not audiences the size that the Royal Met Society could reach. So we've upskilled the communicators to do that. So I'm going to leave you with one final thought. Hopefully you can take this through the course of the next few sessions. And it relates to a report that came out earlier this week. So AXA produced a future risk report, and it was published earlier this week. And it's no surprise, I guess, that the pandemic is an issue, a concern, I guess, for people in the UK and around the world. But this report actually highlights that in the UK, whether they're people, members of the general public or experts, the top concern at the moment is climate change. And the pandemic is actually second on the list behind climate change. That's also the same not only in the UK, but across Europe. And it's only when they look across the global scale that the pandemic still sits at number one and climate change comes second just behind that. So I think the main message to take away from this, my presentation really is that, you know, today's population are feeling more concerned about the risks of climate change than ever before. And now really is a good time to take action. So have a great few sessions. I look forward to finding out any outcomes that come from the rest of this climate risk assessment. But I'm going to hand over now to the fellows who can start the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz. That was a fantastic introduction. Martine, and you're with us as well. You might need to unmute yourself. Hello.
Hi there.
Okay, I'm just going to spotlight the two of us to start off with. Okay. Lovely. So we will take you through a little introduction very shortly. But just to first of all say hello from Martine and myself. So we are the fellows that were mentioned before, and we were given a fellowship to deliver this afternoon's workshop and some other outputs for the COP26 Universities Network. And there's been some really good content from the fellows on days 1 and 2 as well. So hopefully you've been able to join for some of that. But also we've got a really exciting afternoon for you here. So yeah, Martine, shall I share our introductory slides?
Please do, yes.
Yeah.
It's probably worth saying that initially the fellowships were designed to be separate, but actually we found such a good synergy and we felt it was better serving to our community to actually gel together. So our two teams have worked extremely hard in the last few weeks to put together what we hope is going to be a really exciting and broad-ranging program that everybody will enjoy and benefit from and have their questions answered and also make contributions to.
Okay, fab. All right then, so this is a bit about the structure that we're going to go through today, and we also just wanted to take a few minutes to introduce you to the speakers you'll be hearing from. So Martine.
So the three key questions, four questions that we want to really tackle today is why communication is difficult and what decision makers need and want and how we present risk information. There will be a goodie bag to take away today, and there also will be development of a broader toolkit of resources in order to help underpin theoretically but also practically communication of difficult subjects, particularly climate risk. So this is the AU4DM team. We are an organisation that looks at decision making under uncertainty for decision makers, and I would like to invite my colleagues to put the cameras on and get ready to introduce themselves, and while they're doing that I'll introduce myself. So I am Director of the Applied Statistics and Risk Unit at the University of Warwick, and I engage with decision makers of all different kinds with probabilistic modelling and other things to help them to make decisions when there is uncertainty in their system. So Mark, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks very much, Martine. So good afternoon, everyone. My name's Mark Workman. I'm a specialist in strategic foresight, and I'm based at Imperial College London.
Thank you. Paulina, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
I'm Paulina, and I also work with at Imperial College and part of the IU4DM with Martine and Mark.
Thank you. And Joe, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hello, I'm Joe. I'm a research fellow in the Environmental Humanities and Digital Humanities at the Sussex Humanities Lab, and I'm a science fiction writer.
Thank you.
Amazing. So I'm now going to take us on and introduce you to the Climate Action Unit team. So the Climate Action Unit team works together to change how scientists, policymakers, businesses and the media engage with one another about climate change. And our aim is really to make sure that climate risk information is a more effective driver of the government policies and processes that are needed to curb climate change. And this is one of our kind of 3 key areas that we work on at the Climate Action Unit, but this is the one we really want to talk to you about today. So I'm here, I am a project manager at the Climate Action Unit, and I kind of coordinate lots of our activities internally and externally. But the brains behind it all is really my 2 colleagues, so I'd like to introduce themselves. So that's Dr. Chris de Meyer and Dr. Lucy Hubble-Rose. Chris, do you want to say hello?
Hi, I'm Chris. I'm a neuroscientist by background, but I've been working on the communication of climate change for quite a few years now. And why a brain scientist is involved with that will hopefully become apparent a bit later in the session.
Hi, I'm Lucy Hubble-Rose and I'm a geographer by background, but my role at the CAU is largely about bringing people together. So I specialise in designing and facilitating sessions that bring together policymakers with researchers and a whole host of other groups of people to help explore how to improve that communication and build new connections.
Amazing. Thank you both. So you've now had a chance to meet both the teams. And as you'd have seen from the agenda that we just ran through, there's going to be sessions from presenters across both of those teams interspersed with one another. So we've got different contributions to give under the same kind of themes and topics. So what to expect from this workshop? Well, this is going to be a very multidisciplinary workshop. You can tell from the way the speakers have introduced themselves that we've all come from quite different backgrounds, and that's really interesting and links to what Liz said about perhaps one size doesn't fit all with risk communication, and so we believe we can really benefit from drawing together from lots of different backgrounds here. What to expect in a practical sense? Well, you're going to be getting involved with some polling. We're going to give you some classwork to do, and there's going to be a range of discussions that you can be involved within the sessions and things to take home and do as well. So expect to be interactive. We'd love you to get involved here. And you'll have a chance to do the following things. So you'll be learning about the challenge of communicating risk, particularly on climate change. You'll get a chance to practice some communication skills, and you'll be able to help co-produce a really important toolkit ahead of COP26, which the AU4DM team will be sort of leading the charge on, but they want all of your input too. So just some housekeeping before we start. We want to encourage you to engage and interact as much as possible during the activities. The chat function should be open. We've got polling, we've got word clouds, we've got some Google Forms. So please do give us your feedback. We really want to hear from you and make this as interactive as something remote can be. We've scheduled in 3 breaks. So we've got a 10-minute break and then a 20-minute break and then another 10-minute break. And we will try our very best to protect that time so that you can step away from your screen if you need to, get up and move about. We know it's a long afternoon and we know it's a Friday. So we're really grateful you're here. And yes, we want to try and protect you and give you some breaks in that time, really. Due to the high attendee numbers, we've decided to automatically mute the participants, but please, if you'd like to speak at any point, if you just use the raise hand function, and then one of our team will unmute you. And there may be points in the session where we actively encourage you to do this. So we may want you to give us some verbal feedback. As I said, chats and comments are welcome. We've got a bit of time in session 5 of the day to reflect on these. So if we can't pick them up during the sessions because things are getting a bit tight for time, please note that we will come back to them and give you an opportunity to speak to all of the fellows at the end of session 5. And then just a technical point, which is that we will be using Slido today. So hopefully you will have a phone or another electronic device near you. The way to engage with Slidos is, so some of them we've got inbuilt QR codes on the slides. So you'll just need to hold your phone up and take a picture of the code and it will link you straight into the poll. If that doesn't work for you, or if your phone doesn't have a QR reader inbuilt, you can just go to the web address that will be on the slides and it will give you an event code to type in, and that's how you can engage. So I think that's it on the housekeeping. Just to say, I know I am, and I think Martine is as well. We're really excited that you've chosen to join us for this afternoon. So thank you, and we hope you get lots out of it. And please do feedback to us at the end of the session how you found it and what you thought. Any other words, Martine, before we move on?
I think we can go straight into it. Thank you, Alyssa. Freya.
Fab. So I think it's Mark. Are you our first speaker of the day?
I am indeed.
Lovely. Thank you.
I just need somebody. That's it. So I'll now share my screen. Okay. Right, thank you very much for that introduction, Freya and Martine. So good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are tuning in from in the world. My name is Mark Workman, as alluded to earlier. I'm a specialist in strategic foresight, which essentially means I use mixed methods to identify risks and opportunities in different possible futures. I'm a coastal engineer and an environmental economist by academic training. I'm an ex-combat unit commander, having commanded a lot of light rail units in the expeditionary wars post 9/11. Also run a commercial business unit out in Africa and Asia, providing medical consultancy and security consultancy in difficult places. And basically what the team has asked me to do is to communicate and to contextualize the state of research in sort of decision making, and particularly around this construct around the decision value chain, which I'll explain in greater depth later in this talk. And essentially, I've got sort of 3 intentions behind this aspect of the conference. One, in this presentation, I'm going to sort of reframe and recalibrate what we've done over the 9 hours of previous talks that have been given in the previous 2 days by the excellent 6 other fellows. State whereabouts the state of research is around decision making for climate change, or basically the translation of decision support, how it's communicated into decision making and developed into policy. And then I think the third component of the talk is very much to start signposting where within this sort of very conceptualized construct of a decision value chain, how other members of the team will build on that going forward, as well as signposting other materials that we haven't had time to cover in this presentation, in this session today, but for which we do have materials. With regards to the actual presentation proper, the first point's been covered by the other fellows. In essence, climate change risks aren't really risks. Past data sets are no longer as reliable basis to allow the development of probability functions. So as a function of that, we're dealing increasingly with uncertainty. And the second point is that the capacity and competency of the institutions and the individuals that we have around managing the consequences around decision-making under uncertainty need to be substantially improved. There are a number of issues here. There's a huge research gap, which I'll highlight later. There's a need to improve the competency of institutions and individuals. And the ability to anticipate and be prepared for high impact, high uncertainty events, we could do with substantive improving on. And then with regard sort of communicating climate risk, it is an integral component of translating decision support into policy and operational action, and most importantly, gaining societal buy-in. And there's a number of things to consider, and this ties into the fact that we do desperately need to build our capacity in this area. We need to consider developing our decision-making and communication around climate risk from an end-to-end perspective around this conceptualized value chain. There needs to be more of an iterative exchange with policy and society and stakeholders, rather than having policy developments very much separate from the way that decisions are made. We need to integrate more participatory processes in order to harvest multiple values, encourage greater diversity, stakeholders and viewpoints within a lot of the risk communication and decision making that takes place. And we need to develop more methods. We are pathologically wedded to a lot of parametric modeling, and there are a host of other methods that handle uncertainty better in some respects than a lot of the parametric modeling that's used to support climate risk communication and decision making. And ultimately, sort of one of the final points that we'll leave on is the fact that this is a huge leadership, cultural and competency challenge that needs to be grasped sooner rather than later if we're really serious about addressing the climate change challenge. So reiterating what's been covered by the other research fellows earlier in the week, the effects of climate change are significant and they are deeply uncertain. It's multidimensional, it's non-linear, prone to cascade and threshold effects. The transmission and propagation factors are complex and often polycentric. As I said, this has kind of been covered in greater detail, but I just wanted to make sure we've reframed this. Not only is the dealing with the effects of climate change significant, but addressing the causes are just as complex. What we're looking at here is a meta-analysis of some of the changes that need to get made to the European energy system in order to realize net zero. And what we're talking about is systemic transformational change on a scale unprecedented in recent human history. And not only is the size of the challenge substantive, but it too is prone to non-linear issues. And I just highlight in red the box on this slide here, the fact that a 10% reduction in renewables capacity that doesn't get built will almost certainly necessitate a 50 to 100% increase in carbon capture, removal and storage capacity. So again, deeply, deeply complex. More worryingly, if you think about the amount of work that's been done on decision making and risk management, that's salient to climate change, as highlighted in the olive green here, relative to the broader corpus of literature, it only forms a tiny component of the amount of research that's been undertaken. So this area as to how we communicate climate, how we translate it into risk and decision making is again a substantive research gap that could do with improving. More worryingly, the research that has actually been undertaken is substantially skewed. It suffers from a huge lack of diversity. 90% of it comes from Europe and America, as highlighted in the bottom right pie chart. 80% of it is produced by male researchers, as highlighted in the top right pie chart. 60% is quantitative. I'm not quite sure what the 29% having no methods is about. And then I think most worrying for me is the huge skewing to science and engineering and economics. And in fact, the net zero transformation and dealing with a lot of the climate change communication risk and translating it into decisions very much lies in the realm of social sciences. And yet the climate change risk sort of research space within this very much puts only about 20% of the amount of research taking place in this area. Right, now to the sort of the crux of the sort of where we sit with regards our competency around decision making. and how we assimilate risk communication into decision making and policy. We are inherently bad at this. These are a short list of examples. I'm only going to cover 2 examples in any detail. The first one is obviously the Chilcot review in the top left. You know, the justification of going into Iraq, and we were very puzzled when we were assembled at the border to do so, was based on the intelligence community's assessment that it possessed weapons of mass destruction. The US intelligence community's got an annual budget of $50 billion. That would be great to bring to the science communication and decision-making field. It employs 20,000 analysts, and in 2002, it validated the White House's assertion that Iraq did indeed have weapons of mass destruction, and we all know that was absolute rubbish. The second point that second vignette I'd like to highlight is the global financial crisis that only took place about 13 years ago, and that's highlighted in that classic Bank of England model estimate in the bottom right of the graph here, right of the slide here. And in essence, the global financial crisis, I mean, we've got short memories here. I mean, it resulted in some of the biggest bankruptcies in history, resulted in 30 million people going unemployed, and countries were on the brink of bankruptcy. I mean, Greece and Spain were very close to teetering amongst other countries. And it cost the global economy $20 trillion. And yet in November 2006, a survey of professional forecasters examining, wait for it, 45,000 economic data series saw only a 1 in 500 chance of an economic meltdown taking place as that took place in September 2008. So we need to improve on this. And this again is brought to bear even more so and more recently in the fact that we actually have a number of tools, but my goodness, we need to pay more attention to them and we need to act on them far better than we do at present. For example, on the National Risk Register in 2017, it was highlighted that pandemic influenza was a substantially high impact and a relatively high probability of happening. And yet I think it would, we could state quite categorically that the UK's response could have been a lot better than it actually was. And there are other risks on there that would have equally systemic effects. Severe space weather would take out substantial proportions of the UK national grid, and the national grid is increasingly important with the electrification of more and more services as a function of realising net zero. Effusive aerosols through volcanic eruptions will almost certainly impact substantive bread baskets globally as well. And I pull a screen grab of a recent article from the Times highlighting how the UK is really struggling to cope with the disruptions that are taking place at the moment, whether they be empty supermarket shelves as a function of lorry drivers, fuel shortages, and so on. And let's be honest, if we're dealing with climate change, these are very, very small issues relative to that might happen going forward. And talk about timeliness. Just before the pandemic, the UK managed to disband the UK National Security Committee's subcommittee on threats, hazards, risks, and contingencies, thereby lending greater credence to the fact that we really do struggle to have the institutional structures and systems in place to manage this sort of thing. Right now, sort of the crux of the framing of the rest of the this afternoon session. This is the sort of very much the stylized decision value chain that the teams come up with. In essence, it covers the analytical community having a large role in the foresight and insight generation on the left-hand side, through to the greater role of policymakers and decision-making through the decision construct and the sort of towards the right, and then the operationalization and implementation of the sorts of decisions that come out from the decision-making on the right-hand side. And there's a stylized feedback loop that then should allow the feedback to take place between what was found, what was intended, and that was realized to be fed into future decision-making processes. But one thing that's really keen to make sure that's highlighted here is that how decisions regarding policy that are formulated and the role of detailed analysis and expertise in the process of policy development and its impact on final policy output is actually really poorly researched. You can understand why that might be the case, But I think with all the substantive number of policy failures that we have had, it would be probably very sensible to actually increase research in this area. And another thing that I sort of wanted to highlight from this very stylized value chain is that if you think of all the actors, and Martine will cover this later in her presentation, of all the actors that are involved from the analytical community through to the policy-making community and the decision maker, which in this architecture is kind of stylized as the minister. They consist of actors with very different cultures. And no matter how close the dialectic processes that takes place between these different actors, as a generalization, you have to emphasize the fact that the analytical community undertaking evidence gathering analysis is very much a numerist, reductionist community that's rooted in deductive logic, whereas the policymakers are far more open to debates, negotiations, and has a culture which is far more narrative based and framed around the logic of abductive reasoning, thinking about what may happen and extrapolating going forward. And elements of this will be covered by Freya later in terms of how to engage your end user by understanding these cultural differences. Lucy and Chris will cover golden nuggets we wish you knew before you started engaging with policymakers. And then, as I said, Martine will expand upon that's covered in the bottom part of this slide in her presentation later. Now, looping back to the fact that we have made some appallingly bad decisions or coped not terribly well in the light of some high impact, high uncertainty events in the recent past. The fact is that as human beings, when dealing with uncertainty, particularly deep uncertainty, we are prone to huge biases, and the deep uncertainty very much plays and distorts our decision making as a function of these biases. And some work that the AU4DM network on the impact of the visualization of uncertainty on decision making highlights that it cuts across all aspects of decision making, whether it be how a decision is made, the speed with which a decision is made, and the decision outcomes. And steeped in the sort of early work of Kahneman Tversky in sort of the 1970s, as highlighted by the Cognitive Bias Index, over 150 biases have been mapped, and we haven't really developed the process or integrated them into decision making and risk communication to compensate for them as much as we should. As a function of that, Freya will cover the psychology involved in communicating risks about climate change in the next session immediately after this. She's also going to cover writing hacks from science journalism, which essentially play to enhancing the way that we communicate to take advantage of these biases and make messages land better. And then Joe will cover a recorded session later on the excellent work that the team did around the visualization of uncertainty and the tools that can be used in order to do that better. Right, in the final part of this presentation, I'd just like to cover the fact that there are a number of aspects that we need to improve upon. And one of the most salient is sort of moving from this very didactic information deficit model, which we can highlight on the left-hand side of this slide here, in the way that we communicate both climate risk and the decisions that get made off the back of that climate risk, to a more dialogue-based model, as highlighted in the middle. And this is really important on a number of levels. Not only does it bring in societal actors into decision-making and create greater capacity around understanding issues regarding climate risk, but as Jeff Mulligan said in this excellent blog in 2020, we actually have there's a really important need to fuel social imagination at the moment. At the moment, the future seems to be owned by a handful of actors that that Jeff calls these zombie orthodoxies, and we really need to break out of that. And a key way of doing that is by integrating societal actors into climate risk and decision making. And just tying in with the opening talk, I just highlight the Art of Rhetoric work by Aristotle, just highlighting the fact that there's a lot of work in the space, and some of it's 23 centuries old, and perhaps we could actually bring some of that 23 centuries old work more to the fore in the work that we do. I don't really have time to go into this. I'm kind of running out of time as it is. But what's encouraging is that this dialogue type model is being built upon. The Climate Assembly, okay, it only had 100 plus members involved to represent the UK population, but it is a start, and ministers are being held to account on some of the findings there. And more encouragingly, organisations such as Anglian Water have Newmarket, and they have effectively a 19,000 person living lab. And these sort of things are mechanisms by which we can build this greater dialogue going forward. This is my pet favourite, the issue regarding how we address climate risk and uncertainty. We really do need to start creating greater discipline as to the tools that we use to address the uncertainty space, to make sure that we actually understand the risks and uncertainties that we're facing. And this is basically a very stylized categorization of uncertainty. You kind of have on the left-hand side a very deterministic construct. For example, actuaries use this, where they have long-run data sets. Then you have more probabilistic constructs, whereby, for example, on a centralized energy system, you have a finite number of alternate futures where you can apply probability functions. And then on the right-hand side, you have true ambiguity, i.e. deep uncertainty. And I think a number of the issues that have been highlighted by other fellows over the last 2 days really do fit within this space. And it's just really important, and it's just an issue that I keep bringing up about regarding our desire to be wedded to these parametric decision support tools, is the fact that when you're dealing with highly ambiguous futures, the capacity for models to be able to capture the uncertainties is highly problematic, and some would say impossible. For example, how do you embed ethical uncertainties within a model? And further to that, you don't need to use parametric support tools for decision support tools for deep uncertainties. You can use science fiction, you can use other forms of decision support. And this is some work that we won't cover today, but I highlight at the bottom there the fact that there's a piece of work by the AE4DM network on how to use decision support tools for complex decisions under uncertainty. I'd like to highlight in the last minute that essentially there are also a number of decision support tools beyond modelling. The government is aware of them, but the problem that we have is actually integrating these into the policy process. At the moment, it's not possibly done as effectively as it might be done. And finally, in the last 30 seconds, I'd just like to emphasize that this is essentially a leadership, cultural and competency challenge, and we need to improve on all three. And this sort of vignette here highlights the incompetence with which a professional cricketer would develop around being a professional cricketer if they didn't get coaching and feedback. And yet, in such important issues regarding decision-making, climate risk, communication, and enacting on addressing climate change, we don't do enough ex post analysis as to how this can be done better. So that ends my presentation. I'm now going to hand over to Freya, who's going to talk about how the brain deals with risks.
Amazing stuff, Mark. Thank you. Wow, that was a whirlwind. There's so much more for me to go and read and really understand about that now.
We did have a request. Is there a request to share the slides and a request for Mark to post the link to the blog he referred to in the chat? So Mark, if you could get busy on that one, that would be great. Thank you, Freya.
Lovely, great. Everyone's taking on board the advice to please engage with us, so we like that. Okay, so I'm going to move us on now to session 2B, and as Mark has alluded to, this is going to be a session that we call Risk for Elephants, and it's basically talking about the insights from the sciences of the brain and the mind about how we handle risk, how it comes across to us, what it evokes in us, how we as humans kind of engage with that concept. So I'm not the expert on this one, but Chris de Meyer is. So Chris, I'm going to hand over to you actually to take people through some of the insights that we kind of use at the CAU.
Okay, thank you, Freya. So Risk for Elephants, what is this all about? So first, when we're talking about climate risk communication, there's of course a lot of knowledge and expertise already out there. There's people who are doing the doing, and I guess that there's a lot of you here today who are sort of at the call phase of trying to make climate risk communication land with different decision makers. Or you might be a communicator, a journalist of some kind. What we're seeing more recently is also lots of empirical studies that test uncertainty and risk representation specifically around climate change. That's a new field that's kind of emerging the last couple of years. But what is not so often understood or known, but widespreadly known, is that there's also a science of communicating risk that goes back quite a few decades earlier. And the types of insights that go into that science of communicating risk is there's a branch that studies the psychology of risk perception. How are people perceiving risk? And some of that research was going on decades before climate change became an actual risk problem. But there's also more and more across neuroscience and psychology, this kind of general information about how brains operate that can help us to understand how messages land, how to make them more effective, and why sometimes the effect that we were hoping our communication would have, why that isn't happening. So we're going to look at 3 insights here that can help you to understand some of the things that go on when you're trying to communicate your climate risk. And we're going to do a little activity in the middle, little breakout room activity in the middle of this presentation. So you best get ready for that particular one. So the first insight of our 3 insights is that our brains aren't engaging in one type of thinking, but at least in 2 different types of thinking. And those are our intuitions and reasoning. And I've put just one word down for each of them to identify how they are different. So our intuitive thinking is automatic, which means that it's going on in the back of our brains all of the time, outside of our conscious awareness, outside of us having to pay any attention to it, it's happening. Our brains are churning away. The other, the word that I put down for reasoning is controlled, meaning that we have to pay attention, we have to exert effort for reasoning to happen, and especially for it to happen well. Some of you may know about Kahneman work, the system 1, system 2, or the process 1, process 2, as it's more accurately called in scientific literature. But my favorite metaphor for understanding how these 2 types of thinking in our brain are working together is to think of our intuitive thinking as a giant elephant and to think of reasoning as a little rider that sits on top of the elephant. Now, the conventional wisdom holds that it's our reasoning, our little rider, the little voice in our heads that is in control or should be in control. But what the science is telling us is that it's the elephant that is calling the shots most of the time. The elephant is determining the direction of travel, and the rider is usually just there to make up the stories of why the elephant is choosing that particular path, that particular direction. So most of the time, the rider is just there to justify and rationalize what our intuitions are giving us, rather than to analyze rationally, to think rationally. Of course, there are exceptions to that, and doing hardcore science is probably one of them. So what's the importance, the relevance of this elephant and rider concept to risk communication? When applied to the psychology of risk perception, people have made a distinction between risk as formal analysis and risk as feeling. And what sits in the middle between those 2 is a risk as intuitive evaluation. So risk as formal analysis, that's what we're doing when we are doing science, when we're thinking long and hard about a particular risk, when we're writing analysis codes or coming up with new algorithms to analyze risk, when we're doing that real nuts and bolts science and analyst work. But most of the time in our daily lives, everyone, including all of us, are using this risk as intuitive evaluation and risk as feeling in how we are determining for ourselves those things that are risky, that we need to pay attention to, that we need to be careful with. And so this risk as intuitive evaluation is that sort of almost automatic response that you get when you see a particular problem presented at you, a particular issue being discussed. And you just get this sense that something's not right here, that something's might be a little bit dangerous. Now, the important, or one of the reasons why this elephant and rider metaphor is so apt is that probably about 95% of what our brains do sits in the elephant. And it's only a few percentage that sits in that rider, that sits in that formal analyzing or formal reasoning thing. And that's really quite counterintuitive, because of course, we feel that being rational, that being clever and smart about things and becoming an expert in something, that really should be sitting on our rider, and that is the stuff that drives expertise. But actually what happens when we're becoming an expert in something is that certain types of knowledge that help us to analyze risk formally become part of our intuitive evaluation. So getting a risk, really grasping a risk, seeing that something is a problem, that is part of our elephant. And we can sort of, as we're becoming an expert in particular problems in society, as we're spending a lot of time thinking about this, that becoming an expert in something such that you immediately can analyze a piece of information, that means that that formal evaluation moves into our elephant and becomes that really intuitive evaluation, the seeing that something is a particular problem. Now, what this doesn't mean, this elephant and rider thing, it's not the distinction, or there's nothing here that necessarily says that a piece of, or a reaction to a risk that comes out of our elephant or that comes out of a rider is necessarily right or wrong, or necessarily rational or irrational. Sometimes the elephant gets a lot of bad press, and people think that all of our irrational thinking sits in the elephant. But that's not really the case, because a lot of our good thinking, as we're becoming an expert, also sits in our elephant. And so it's, for instance, the thing that keeps you alive when you're crossing a busy road. That's a very day-to-day risk situation where the elephant is very useful to us. And of course, as Mark in the example on the banking crisis showed us, you could have banks spending like hundreds and thousands of man hours formally analyzing the risk of their balance sheets and completely missing the actual risk of the real world. So risk as formal analysis can get it incredibly wrong as well. And sometimes risk as intuitive evaluation actually gets it right. The second point is that for people really to get something, including the policymakers that you're engaging with or the decision makers that you're engaging with, it really needs to land with their elephants. You need to connect with their elephants. And we recently tested that. We had a room full of policymakers where we showed them future projections of things like heat waves and droughts and other climate hazards. And we asked them, how does this land with you? And initially, because we had just presented the data, initially they said, these are just numbers on a page. They don't mean anything to us. And then we started to storytell around that. We started to link those numbers to things they already had experience of, a heat wave that had already happened, a drought or a crop failure that had already happened. And by doing that storytelling, we were addressing their elephant, and we were making those numbers acquire meaning for them. So connecting with people's elephant is a really important thing for people to get the risk that you're talking about. The final point here is that good, effective risk communication is not the same as scaring people. So there was a lot of soul searching of the climate science community after the recent IPCC report, where they were asking, have we been strong enough in our warnings before? Should we have been starker in the risks that we're painting? And I would say it wasn't an absence of the starkness of the message of how the future might pan out. It was more trying to make, or what was more needed than scaring people was trying to make that connection with the risks that people already naturally understand. So to summarize our elephant and rider metaphor and how it is important for risk communication, for people to really get that climate risk that you want to talk about, try to connect to their elephant. That means, and we'll pick that up in a little bit, is that you need to start with listening first, because if we're immediately going to broadcast, then we will risk not connecting to people's elephant. So by starting to listen first, you can figure out the connection. We'll come back to that a little bit later. And then the final point here is that effective risk communication is not the same as scaring. And to just give one example of why it isn't even useful to scare people, if you would enter a hospital with a dangerous condition, your doctor would come to you and look at you and recognize the risk to your life and might say, well, you're at big risk, you might succumb in the next hour or so, so you need immediate treatment. You don't want your doctor to be scared. You don't want them to start panicking. In fact, if they do, you'll probably ask for a different doctor. So our second insight is Ginger the dog. And what do we mean with this? This is Ginger. So for those of you who don't have a big screen in front of you, this is a Far Side cartoon where the top panel says what we say to dogs, and it's a man berating his dog in long sentences. And the bottom panel says what dogs hear, blah, 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 Ginger, blah, 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 blah. And we use this metaphor in every situation or to describe situations where what we think we are saying is not what other people are hearing. And we often use Ginger, we make Ginger explicit at the start of a conversation where we bring policymakers and scientists or people from other decision backgrounds together with scientists. We often do some Ginger exercises to make us familiar with this idea that we use language differently across different sectors. Now, why does this happen? Why does Ginger appear? It appears specifically in those contexts where we're using abstract words and phrases to describe complex things, which, as Mark introduced us to, happens a lot within the space of climate risk communication. What can happen in that situation is that these abstract words can develop different intuitive understandings, different felt meanings, different elephant understandings with different groups of people. And the reasons are, of course, jargon. Avoiding jargon is always a good thing to do, but it doesn't stop there. Often we have words that we think are fairly simple words and that we have a fairly clear definition for in our own field, but that through practice differences mean something completely different in a different sector. And the third one is value differences. If we have different things that we care about in life, we will also develop different felt meanings about certain words. I'm going to focus on the practice differences here because it's mostly important for when we're thinking about cross-sectoral communication of climate risk. So here's one example, a conservative risk estimate. If you ask a climate scientist what that means, most of them will say, well, that's being fairly rosy and optimistic. It's choosing the side of least drama. But if you ask risk experts, risk analysts in other domains, you will often hear that they look at it as the exact opposite. It is defining the worst possible outcome first. And so it doesn't take much imagination to see that if you're organizing a meeting with people from these different backgrounds, that it might take a while for them to discover that they have these opposing meanings. And we certainly have been in situations like that where we organized workshops and it took a while for people to figure out that they had that different understanding of it. So, second example is one that we've been talking about in the previous days a lot, like how do we communicate scientific uncertainty better and should we do it and to what degree should we do it? So if you ask a scientist, what does that mean? Then at least one definition of scientific uncertainty, the direct scientific uncertainty as it's often called, is a measure of the spread in the data. But if you ask sort of the ordinary person, non-scientists, what the word uncertainty means, it's being in doubt, not knowing, having, like not feeling that you have any knowledge. And sometimes that can come even with discomfort and saying, oh, I'm not really comfortable with this state of not knowing. Now, what happens if you put the word scientific in front of that word uncertainty that people interpret through being in doubt or not knowing, is that you're signaling to those audiences that the science doesn't know. And we've certainly seen it happen a lot, where scientists publish a report, the media reports on it, and the comments on social media are, well, that's an organization saying they don't know anything about this particular problem. So that's a very, very big challenge for when we are trying to communicate scientific uncertainty. So with those two examples in mind, those are two that we observe a lot in this space of climate communication. But because you've all been doing the same kind of work, we have, of course, multiple examples of that probably in your own experience and backgrounds. So we're going to hand over to Lucy, or I will hand over to Lucy, to set us up for a little exercise on this.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so we are going to put you into a breakout room with two other people. And what we would like you to do in that breakout room is to talk about your own examples of Ginger the dog moments. So what I want you to do is I want you to think particularly about times when you have been speaking to somebody from another discipline or a different sector, and when there may have been misunderstandings or differences in the definitions that you've been using for particular terms. What we want you to do is we want you not just to think about when that happened, but what happened in that moment. So what was the effect of that Ginger moment on the conversation that you were having or the work that you were trying to do? And also think about how you dealt with that situation. So at that moment, how did you manage it?